The stagecoach hit a rut so hard that Anna Ralston's hat flew clean off her head and landed in the lap of a sleeping cattle broker. And that was when she realized with cold certainty that she was on entirely the wrong coach, bound for entirely the wrong town, carrying a land deed to a property she had never seen in a place she had never intended to go. The year was 1878, and the New Mexico territory was not a forgiving landscape for mistakes. The sun pressed down on the cracked earth like a flat iron on dry cotton, and the red dust that rolled through the windows of the Butterfield coach settled onto everything: Anna's dark traveling dress, the sleeping broker's wide jowls, the leather satchel she clutched against her ribs with both gloved hands. Inside that satchel was everything she owned in the world: a change of linen, $23.40, a small photograph of her late mother, and the deed, notarized in St. Louis 3 weeks prior, bearing the seal of one Judge Aldous Pinkett and granting legal ownership of 412 acres in Caro County, New Mexico, to one Miss Anna Ralston, sole heir of the late Thomas Ralston, her father. She had been supposed to board the stage to Santa Fe, where a man named Gerald Hooper from the Territorial Land Office was to meet her. Instead, owing to a miscommunication at the depot in Albuquerque that she intended to revisit with considerable force at her earliest opportunity, she had boarded the Caro Creek line, which was presently delivering her at speed toward a small cattle town called Harrow Bend. She pressed her face to the window and squinted at the terrain. It was beautiful in a severe way, she admitted grudgingly. Great mesas rose orange and amber against the blue sky. Cottonwood trees traced the line of a creek bed somewhere to the south. A hawk circled something patient and unhurried above a ridge. It was the kind of country that looked as though it had been there before time and would be there long after, and it had absolutely no interest in her problems. The stage lurched to a stop and the driver's voice came down from above, rough and cheerful. "Harrow Bend, ladies and gentlemen. 45 minutes, then we roll on to Caro Creek." Anna felt a small wave of relief. Caro Creek. That was where she needed to be. She would simply stay on the coach, let these other passengers stretch their legs, and carry on to the correct destination. She leaned back against the cracked leather seat and began to form, in her mind, the exact words she would deliver to the Albuquerque depot's ticketing agent upon her return. She was still composing this speech when the driver pulled open the door and fixed her with a gap-toothed smile. "This is the end of the line for today, miss. Stage to Caro Creek doesn't run until Thursday." Anna stared at him. "Today is Monday," she said. "Yes, ma'am, that it is." She stared at him a moment longer. He showed no sign of distress about this fact. She gathered her satchel, her hat retrieved from the cattle broker, who had not woken, and her one traveling trunk, and she descended into Harrow Bend, New Mexico territory, with the composed dignity of a woman who was furious and was choosing, for now, to keep it inside. Harrow Bend was small but not dead. A main street of packed dirt ran between two rows of timber and adobe buildings. A general store, a livery, a barber shop, a land and cattle office, two saloons, a doctor's office, and at the far end, a building with a hand-painted sign that read Harrow Bend Hotel, and under it in smaller letters, "Baths Available." A water trough sat in the center of the street, and two horses drank from it in companionable silence. A dog lay in the shade under the general store's porch and did not open its eyes as she walked past. She went to the hotel first because she needed a room and because the sun was genuinely violent. The woman behind the desk was broad-shouldered and gray-haired and introduced herself as Mrs. Cord, and she showed Anna to a second-floor room with a window facing west, a narrow bed with a blue quilt, a washstand, and a small mirror that had a crack running through the lower left corner. $2 a week, meals included," Mrs. Cord said. "Breakfast at 7, supper at 6. Don't bring food into the room, we've enough trouble with mice." "I'll only be here until Thursday," Anna said. Mrs. Cord looked at her with the mild skepticism of a woman who had heard that before. Anna set her trunk at the foot of the bed, removed her gloves, and washed her face with water from the pitcher on the stand. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror. Her dark hair had mostly escaped its pins during the journey. Her brown eyes had the particular brightness that appeared when she was trying not to be overwhelmed. She was 26 years old, and she had come 1,500 miles from St. Louis to claim land she had never seen, land her father had purchased on a gambler's hope and never lived to walk. She had come because there was nothing left for her in St. Louis except her father's debts, and because the deed was real, and because she had decided somewhere around the Missouri River that whatever the land turned out to be, it was hers, and she was going to stand on it. She repinned her hair and went back out into the afternoon. The Land and Cattle Office was a dim, cool room smelling of paper and tobacco. A young clerk with ink-stained fingers told her, apologetically, that the county land registry was maintained in Caro Creek, and that there was nothing he could help her with regarding verification of a deed. He did, however, give her directions to the office of one Walter Carver, who was, as the clerk put it, the man in this county who knows more about property lines than the surveyor does. She found the office, not much more than a room attached to the back of the livery, with a door that stood open to the breeze, and knocked on the frame. "Come in." The man behind the desk was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two past it. He had the kind of face that had been outdoors for all of those years, sun-darkened skin, lines at the corners of dark blue eyes, a jaw that had met some hard weather and was none the worse for it. His dark hair was cut short and slightly unkempt, as though he attended to it when he remembered to. He was wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands, folded on the desk over a map he had been examining, were the hands of a man who worked with them. He looked up at her with an expression that was attentive and quiet, the kind of expression that came from a habit of watching things carefully before speaking about them. "Miss," he said, and the word carried neither presumption nor dismissiveness, just a straightforward acknowledgement that she was there and he was listening. "My name is Anna Ralston," she said. "I was told you might be able to help me with a land matter." He gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat down and placed her satchel on her knees and opened it and withdrew the deed and laid it on the map he had been looking at. His eyes moved over it with the focus of a man reading something that mattered. He did not touch it yet. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he picked it up with two hands and turned it toward the window for the light. "Thomas Ralston," he said, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Anna felt the shift. "You knew him." "Not personally, I know the name. This land," he set the deed down and turned to the map, his finger tracing something across it. "Ralston acreage, 412 acres in the north quarter of Caro County, the creek boundary on the east side." He looked up at her. "Your father bought this land 7 years ago." "6," she said. 1872. He bought it on the strength of a letter from a man named Silas Dodd, who claimed the soil in that valley was suited for wheat and that water rights came with the property. Walter Carver was quiet for a moment. He set the deed flat on the desk again. "Miss Ralston," he said, "there is a problem." "I expected there might be," she said, because she was 26 and had lived enough life to know that things with deeds and land and territories were rarely uncomplicated. "Tell me what it is." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "The Ralston parcel has been under an adverse claim for the past 2 years. A man named Dodd, likely the same Silas Dodd, sold a second deed to a rancher named Burl Hackett. Hackett has had cattle running on that land since 1876 and has been building toward a formal claim of possession. The Territorial Land Office in Caro Creek has been sitting on the matter without resolution." Anna looked at him steadily. "My father's deed is dated 1872. It was notarized and registered in St. Louis." "I know it," Walter said, "which means it predates Hackett's by 4 years and it ought to supersede it entirely. But Hackett has a lawyer in Santa Fe and some arrangement with a county assessor whose name I won't say in mixed company, and the matter has been made deliberately complicated." "Silas Dodd sold the same land twice," Anna said. "He did. And then he left the territory, which is the only smart thing he ever did, because if Burl Hackett gets hold of him, the territorial courts are going to be the least of his concerns. Anna sat with this for a moment. Through the open door she could hear the horses in the livery shifting, the sound of someone hammering somewhere down the street, a crow calling from a post. "I need to be in Caro Creek on Thursday," she said. "I need to be standing in front of whoever at the land office handles this matter with my deed, and whatever documentation I need to prove the Hackett claim is fraudulent. Can you help me get there? And can you help me know what I'm walking into?" Walter Carver looked at her for a moment that was a beat longer than professionally necessary. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been respect, or recognition of a quality he didn't expect to find, or possibly the simple surprise of a man who had prepared himself for a frightened woman and found instead something considerably more resolved. "I can do both of those things," he said. He stood up. He was taller than she had judged from across the desk, broad through the shoulders, with the easy balance of a man who spent more time on a horse than in a chair. He went to the map on the wall and began pointing out the route to Caro Creek, the layout of the land in question, the names she would encounter, the particular obstacles she was facing. Anna leaned forward in her chair and listened with her whole attention. This was how it began. Over the following 2 days, while she waited for Thursday's stage, Walter Carver helped her prepare her case. He was, it turned out, not merely a man who knew about property lines. He was a former deputy from Dona Ana County, who had left that job 3 years prior after a disagreement with a corrupt sheriff. A disagreement that had involved a letter to the territorial governor's office and the subsequent resignation of said sheriff, and had not made Walter Carver popular in certain circles. He had moved to Harrow Bend, set up as a property surveyor and occasional legal consultant, and had spent his time doing work that was useful and straightforward, and had the great advantage of mostly being honest. He had also, Anna learned over 2 evenings in the hotel's small dining room, grown up on a ranch near Las Cruces, lost his parents to a fever when he was 16, worked cattle drives until he was 20, and put himself through enough legal education by correspondence and by reading borrowed books to be dangerous in front of a county judge. She learned these things gradually, in the way you learn things when you are sitting across from someone at a table with coffee between you and a shared problem on the desk, and the evening cooling the air outside the window. He didn't offer information about himself the way some men did, in a flood meant to impress. He gave it in pieces, in response to questions, in the natural course of conversation, and every piece was given without decoration or self-pity. She found this quality so unusual and so appealing that she had to remind herself, on the second evening, that she was here on a business matter, and that Walter Carver was helping her because he was good at his job, not because of anything else. She was not entirely successful in convincing herself of this, but she made the attempt. On Tuesday afternoon, he took her on horseback out to the telegraph station at the edge of town. She had not been on a horse in several years, but managed well enough, to his visible approval, and they sent a telegram to the Territorial Land Office in Caro Creek, notifying them of her intent to appear Thursday with a prior deed and requesting the presence of the examiner of records. Walter drafted the telegram's language, and Anna revised 2 of its phrases to be more direct, and he read her revisions and nodded and said, "That's better," without any of the wounded dignity that men sometimes displayed when a woman improved their work. On Tuesday evening, they sat on the hotel's small porch after supper because the dining room was warm, and the air outside had the particular sweetness that the desert produced after a hot day, when something in the earth released itself, and the sage took on a sharper smell, and the first stars appeared in a sky that went from orange to deep blue to black with a speed that always felt like a held breath being let go. Anna had her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee going cold, and was going over the sequence of arguments she intended to present on Thursday. Walter sat with his long legs stretched out and his hat on his knee and listened to her run through it, and twice asked questions that made her refine a point and once said, "You've got it. You don't need to add anything to that." She looked at him. "What made you leave the deputy's work?" He considered the question without deflecting it, which she appreciated. "The sheriff I worked for was taking money from a land syndicate in exchange for looking the other way on evictions," he said. 3 Apache families had land they'd been farming for a generation, and he was clearing them off it for a cattle company that had no legitimate claim. When I told him I couldn't participate in that, he suggested I find another line of work. "And you wrote to the governor's office?" "I wrote to the governor's office. The sheriff left. The families got to stay on their land at least until the next man came along with money and a different argument." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the part that stays with me. You fix one thing and there's another thing waiting behind it. It doesn't stop." "No," Anna said, "but it matters, the fixing. Even if it doesn't stay fixed forever." He turned his head and looked at her, and in the blue dark his expression was thoughtful and a little soft at the edges. "Where did you get that from?" he asked. Not dismissively, genuinely. "My father," she said. "He was a printer in St. Louis. He printed the wrong newspaper's argument once too many times and lost his shop, but he always said the words had gone out and couldn't be unsaid, and that was worth something." She paused. "He died of a chest illness 2 years ago. This land was the last thing he owned. He never made it out here to see it." "I'm sorry," Walter said, and it was the kind of sorry that meant something. They sat for a while without talking. The night insects started their noise. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called and was answered. The darkness of the territory was a complete darkness, different from city darkness, reaching all the way up into the stars. "Thank you," Anna said finally, meaning it for more than just the conversation. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Wait until Thursday." She turned to look at him and he was already looking at her, and for a moment the space between them had a specific quality, warm and charged and full of something neither of them said. Then he set his hat on his head and stood up and wished her a good night, and she watched him walk down the porch steps into the dark, and she sat there for another quarter of an hour finishing her cold coffee and thinking about things that had nothing to do with land deeds. Wednesday arrived with wind from the west and the smell of distant rain, and Anna spent the morning at the table in Walter's office, going through the relevant sections of territorial property law that he had copied out by hand for her from a legal volume he kept on the shelf. His handwriting was precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write carefully because paper was not always available. She read through everything twice and made notes in the margins. He came back from the livery around mid-morning and hung his hat on the nail behind the door and saw her bent over the papers and made coffee on the small iron stove in the corner without asking if she wanted any, which she did. "Hackett will try to argue continuous possession," he said, bringing her a cup and setting it near her elbow. 2 years of cattle running on the land, improvements made. It's a weak argument against a registered prior deed, but he's got a lawyer who makes weak arguments sound solid. "The deed predates everything," Anna said, "by 4 years. That's not an argument to be made against, that's a fact to be read. Judges sometimes find ways not to read facts when there's money on the other side of the table." Anna looked up at him. "Do you know this particular judge?" "Judge Warren Tate, Caro County. He's fair. He's not on anybody's payroll as far as I know, and I've made it my business to know." He sat down across from her with his own coffee. "What concerns me more is the county assessor, Emmett Gill. He's the one who's been sitting on the resolution. He's got a financial arrangement with Hackett not proven, but I'd wager my horse on it." "Then we go around him," Anna said. "We go directly to the judge." Walter looked at her. "That's what I was thinking." "Then we're thinking the same thing," Anna said and returned to her notes. He watched her for a moment longer than the moment required. She could feel it, though she didn't look up. She kept her expression neutral, and her pen moving and felt, in the very center of her chest, something warming that she had been ignoring since Monday and was finding increasingly difficult to ignore. Midday brought the promised rain, A brief, fierce desert rainstorm that filled the street with red running water and made the air smell overwhelmingly of sage and wet earth. They ate lunch in his office because there was no going anywhere, Mrs. Cord's girl having brought sandwiches and 2 more cups of coffee covered with cloth. They ate with the papers pushed to one side and the rain hammering the roof and the wind shaking the door in its frame. "Tell me what the land looks like," Anna said. "You said you know the parcel." "I surveyed the adjacent property 2 years ago," he said. "Rode through the Ralston acreage to get there. It's good land. Better than Dodd let on and better than what the deed's description gives it credit for. The eastern boundary follows Caro Creek. You've got water rights that will stand up. The creek is in the deed's description and the creek hasn't moved. The soil in the valley floor is dark. Your father's informant was right about the wheat." He paused. "There's a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that's old enough that they must have been there before the territory was organized. Big trees. Good shade. The valley opens up to the south and catches morning light." Anna held very still and listened to him describe the land that was hers. She had been carrying the deed for so long in the abstract, as a document, as a legal claim, as the remnant of her father's hope, that she had not quite allowed herself to picture it as a real place with trees and water and light. Hearing him describe it in that calm, specific way made it real in a new sense, and the realness of it caught her somewhere in the throat. "It sounds like somewhere worth fighting for," she managed. "It is," he said simply. The rain ended as abruptly as it had started, the way desert rain did, as though it had somewhere else to be. They went back to the papers. That evening after supper, Walter Carver asked her if she wanted to walk with him to the edge of town to see where the creek ran, and she said yes because the evening was perfect after the rain, and because she wanted to, and because she had stopped pretending she didn't. They walked through the clean-washed air as the sky went gold and orange, side by side on a path worn by feet, and horses through the scrub grass at the edge of Harrow Bend. The creek was low but running clear, talking over its stones in a quiet voice. Cottonwood leaves moved in the last of the breeze. The light was amber and horizontal and made everything look like something painted. "It reminds me," Anna said, "of the light at home in the evenings in summer. We had a small yard behind the print shop. There was one elm tree, and in summer the light came through it in the late afternoon at this angle. My father would stand there after work and just look at it. He didn't say anything, he just looked like looking was enough." "It usually is," Walter said. She glanced at him. He was looking at the creek with that same quality of attention her father had given to his elm tree, and she thought that this was a man who understood what it meant to pay attention to things, to give them the courtesy of being properly seen. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You could have pointed me to the land office and left it at that." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because it was wrong," he said. "What Dodd did, what Hackett's doing, it's a pattern I've seen too many times. Someone has a legitimate claim and someone with money and local connections decides the law bends around them. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't have to if somebody makes it harder to bend." He paused. "And because you walked into my office on Monday and spread that deed on my desk and told me the situation and asked me what you were walking into, not asking me to fix it for you, just asking to know. That's the kind of thing that makes me want to help." Anna looked at the creek. The sky was going pink now at the horizon. Her heart was doing something complicated and she acknowledged it without immediately doing anything about it. "I've been managing alone for 2 years," she said. "Since my father died, his printer's debts, his estate, the deed and the claim on the land. It's been entirely on my own. I'm not complaining about that, I'm capable of it." "I know you are," he said. "I've watched you work for 2 days, you're more than capable." "What I'm trying to say," she said, and she turned to look at him directly, because she was not a woman who spoke around things when she could speak at them, "is that it is very strange and rather startling to have someone help without being condescending about it. To be treated as a person with a problem rather than a problem in the shape of a person." He met her eyes. The amber light made his dark blue eyes look different, warmer, and his expression was completely open in a way it hadn't been across a desk with papers between them. "You are absolutely a person," he said, and it should have sounded like an ordinary statement, but it didn't. It sounded like something he meant specifically. She laughed. It came out soft and a little startled, the way a laugh does when it's genuine. He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without any restraint, and it changed his face in a way that did something considerable to her composure. They stood by the creek until the last light was gone, talking about everything and nothing, and walked back to town in the dark. Thursday morning arrived with a sky that was completely clear and hard blue, as though the desert had decided to make no excuses for itself. Anna was up before sunrise, dressed in her best traveling suit, dark blue wool, plain but well-made, with her hair coiled neatly and her satchel over her shoulder and the deed wrapped in oilcloth inside it. She came down to breakfast and found Walter already at the table with coffee and 2 plates, and he looked at her and said, "Ready?" And she said, "Since Monday," and he nodded. The stage to Cairo Creek was a smaller, rougher vehicle than the Butterfield coach, drawn by 4 horses that looked like they had opinions about the matter. There were 4 other passengers: a dry goods merchant, a woman with a small boy on her lap, and a leathery cowboy named Pete, who fell asleep before the town was out of sight and snored with the regularity of a clock. Anna sat across from Walter in the swaying coach with her satchel in her lap and went over her arguments one more time in her head. Walter watched the country out the window. Once, when the stage hit a deep rut and she grabbed for the seat strap, his hand came out automatically and steadied her arm, then withdrew immediately and correctly. She noticed both the instinct and the correction. Cairo Creek was larger than Harrow Bend, a genuine town with a proper courthouse, several streets, a bank, and the Territorial Land Office in a 2-story adobe building near the plaza. They arrived with 2 hours before the midday hearing they had requested via telegram. The land office was a bureaucratic place smelling of dust and ink, and the particular irritation of underpaid government work. The examiner of records, a thin, sharp man named Fowler, received them with the cautious hostility of someone who had been put out by the telegram and was looking for a reason to be uncooperative. Walter was polite and specific and used legal language with precision and calm, and when Fowler attempted to redirect them to the county assessor's office, Walter said, very quietly, that they would be proceeding directly to Judge Tate's chambers, and that Mr. Fowler was welcome to contact the assessor's office and let them know. Something in the specific quiet of Walter's voice made Fowler reconsider his position. He pulled the Ralston file from the cabinet. Burl Hackett was a large man who arrived at the courthouse with his lawyer, one Hammond Cross, an oiled and practiced Santa Fe attorney in a good hat. Hackett himself was barrel-chested, red-faced, and moved through the room with the confidence of a man who had never had a judge rule against him. He looked at Anna with the particular dismissal that powerful men sometimes gave to women who appeared in rooms they considered their own, and the dismissal so precisely calibrated Anna's anger that she was grateful for it, because anger made her precise. Judge Warren Tate was a heavy-set man of 60, with a white beard and reading spectacles, and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every variation of human foolishness and could no longer be surprised by any of it. He called the hearing to order in his chambers with the windows open and a fan turning papers gently on the edge of his desk. Hammond Cross presented the Hackett position first. It was, as Walter had predicted, a complex and well-constructed argument centered on continuous possession, territorial improvements, and a legal doctrine about the practical limitations of absentee ownership. It was delivered with confidence and a certain theatrical weight that Anna judged was intended to make her feel outgunned. She was not outgunned. She set the deed on the judge's desk and she spoke clearly and without rushing. She presented the chronology. The 1872 purchase by Thomas Ralston, registered and notarized in St. Louis. The 1874 correspondence between Thomas Ralston and Silas Dodd confirming the transaction and the boundaries. The 1876 emergence of a second sale, 4 years after the first, to Burl Hackett by the same Silas Dodd. A sale that represented straightforward fraud, as Dodd had no right to sell what he had already sold, and that any subsequent possession by Hackett, however prolonged, was possession of land obtained under false pretenses and could not generate a superior claim against the original and legitimate owner. She then made the argument Walter had prepared her for, that the prior deed, registered in the proper jurisdiction before any territorial complication arose, must be given its full legal force, and that any doctrine of continuous possession required, as a threshold matter, that the possession have originated in a good faith transaction, which this one had not. The room was quiet when she finished. Judge Tate looked at the deed for a long time over his spectacles. Hammond Cross made a rebuttal. It was shorter than his opening and considerably less confident. Judge Tate wrote something. He asked Anna 2 questions of clarification. She answered them. He asked Walter a question about the property survey. Walter answered it. He asked Hackett directly whether he had known at the time of purchase that the land had a prior registered owner. Hackett's face went through several shades of red. "I was told it was unencumbered land," he said. "By Silas Dodd," the judge said. "Yes, sir." "Then your quarrel," Judge Tate said, removing his spectacles and folding them, "is with Silas Dodd, not with Miss Ralston. This deed is dated 1872, registered properly, and entirely valid. The Hackett claim is derived from a fraudulent secondary sale and has no standing against it. Miss Ralston is the legal owner of the Ralston parcel in Cairo County." He looked at Fowler from the land office. "Update the registry accordingly." Anna stood perfectly still. The breath she let out was completely even. She had known, going in, that the argument was sound. She had been prepared to trust the soundness of the argument. But there was still, in that moment of hearing the words said aloud by a judge in an official chamber, something that opened in her chest relief and grief for her father that he hadn't heard it, and something else that she would examine later. She thanked the judge. Walter shook the judge's hand. Hackett left with his jaw set and his expensive attorney at his elbow, and at the door he turned back and looked at Anna with an expression that was dark and complex, and Anna met his gaze and held it without blinking until he turned away. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the full force of the midday sun, Walter Carver stopped and looked at her and said, "You were extraordinary in there." Anna turned to face him. The relief had come all the way through her now, and her composure had cracked slightly at the edges, which she permitted. "We were good," she said. "We were very good together." He looked at her, and there was something in the directness of that look that made her heart respond before her head had fully processed what was happening. "We were," he said. They stood on the courthouse steps in the blazing sun in 1878 in a small territorial town in New Mexico and looked at each other, and there was a specific quality to the moment, the way the light fell, the way the air smelled of dust and distant water, the way neither of them moved, that Anna would remember for the rest of her life with the precision that the mind reserves for things that matter. "I need to see the land," she said. "My land. Before I decide anything, before I make any plans for it, I need to ride out there and stand on it." "I know where it is," he said. "Will you take me?" "Yes," he said, and it was the simplest answer he could have given and also, in that moment, the most complete. They arranged horses from the livery in Cairo Creek and rode out in the early afternoon, picking up the county road east and then turning north where Walter knew the boundary. The country changed as they rode, opened up, the valley beginning to show itself between the rises, the soil darkening where the creek ran near, the grass thickening along the lower ground. Anna rode beside him and felt the particular satisfaction of riding toward something rather than away from something, which was different in the body, different in the shoulders and the breath. He pointed it out when they crossed the boundary, an old surveyor's marker in the ground, barely visible through the grass. "That's the southwest corner," he said. "From here north 400 yards, then east to the creek." She urged her horse forward, and they rode along the fence of the air that was her land, unhurried. And the valley opened in front of her with the fullness he had described, the dark soil, the cottonwoods along the creek standing massive and indifferent in the afternoon light, the south-facing slope that caught the morning, the water sound that came through even from this distance. She pulled her horse up at the creek bank and sat there for a long while. The cottonwoods were exactly as he had said, old, enormous, their leaves turning in the slight breeze with a sound like paper, and their shade falling in deep patches on the water that ran clear and quick over pale stones. She dismounted without saying anything and walked to the water and crouched down and put her hand in it. It was cold and real. She had never cried in front of anyone she had known for less than a week. She had cried privately twice in 2 years, and both times had been about her father, and both times she had been entirely alone. The tears that came now were quick and involuntary, and she pressed the back of her wet hand to her face, and they were over in a moment. And when she stood up, Walter Carver was standing a careful distance away looking at the creek and not at her, giving her the space of the moment as naturally as breathing. She walked over to him. Her voice was even. "He never saw it," she said. "He bought it sight unseen, and he never got here." "He got you here," Walter said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking at the creek, the late light on his face, and he meant what he said with a simplicity that bypassed every defense she had and went straight to the center. "I'm going to build something here," she said. "I don't know exactly what yet, but I'm going to build something that deserves this land." "I believe you will," he said. And then, after a pause, "For what it's worth, I hope I get to see it." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek talked over its stones. A red-tailed hawk circled above the cottonwoods. "For what it's worth," she said carefully, "I hope you do too." They rode back to Caro Creek in the long gold light of the evening, side by side and mostly quiet, and the quiet was the comfortable kind, the kind that means something has been said well enough without words. They stayed that night in Caro Creek, separate rooms at the town's respectable hotel. And at supper Anna asked him to tell her about the territory, about the people and the water and the best way to start a wheat operation in this particular valley. And he told her everything he knew with the thoroughness and honesty that she had come to associate with him specifically. And she ate and listened and asked questions, and they sat at that table until the proprietor came through twice, clearing his throat before they finally took the hint. In the morning, Anna went back to the land office and had the deed properly recorded and transferred, and walked out into the Caro Creek Plaza with the paper in her hands that confirmed everything, and stood in the sun and felt, for the first time since St. Louis, entirely like herself. Walter was waiting for her at the edge of the plaza, leaning against the wall with his hat tipped back and his arms crossed, and when she came out he straightened and looked at her face and read the result on it and smiled, that full, unguarded smile that she had seen the first time by the creek in Harrow Bend, and that she had quietly decided, to see a great many more times. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. They took the stage back to Harrow Bend that afternoon. The ride was long and warm, and the leathery cowboy Pete was on this coach too, still sleeping with the same clockwork reliability. The dry goods merchant from the previous day tried to strike up a conversation, and Anna managed it pleasantly and then redirected her attention to the window, where the country rolled past in its severe beauty, and she thought about what she was going to do next. She had the land. She had the legal confirmation. She had $23 and some cents, which was not enough to do much with 400 acres and a creek. She needed to stay in the territory. She needed to find work while she arranged financing for the most basic beginning of a farm operation. She needed to be practical. She also needed, and she was honest with herself about this, to work out what was happening between herself and the man sitting across from her with his long legs angled and his hat down over his face and his breathing even in the afternoon heat. They got back to Harrow Bend in the early evening. Walter walked her to the hotel with her trunk, which had been fetched from her room while they were away. At the foot of the hotel steps he stopped and she stopped, and they looked at each other in the blue evening air. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. "I'm going to stay," she said. "I can't go back to St. Louis with nothing, and I'm not about to. I'll need work in the short term. Mrs. Cord mentioned she needs help in the hotel some mornings, and I'll need to start finding out how to get seed and a plow and whether there's anyone in this territory who will lend capital to a woman with a land deed and a plan." He nodded slowly. "There's a bank in Caro Creek. The manager, a man named Ellis, is practical. He lends on deeds if the land is sound, and I can speak to the soundness of yours." "You've done enough," she said. "I haven't done nearly enough," he said, and it was a simple statement of intention. She looked at him steadily. "Walter." "Anna." It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both heard it. "I don't want you to help me because you feel obligated," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't need saving. What I need is partners, people who treat the arrangement as an equal one." "That is the only kind of arrangement I'm interested in," he said. "Then we understand each other," she said. "I think we do," he said. They stood for another moment in the pleasant evening. "Supper tomorrow." He said, "Supper tomorrow," she said. She went inside. She went up the stairs to her room with the cracked mirror and the blue quilt, and she set her satchel on the bed and opened it and took out the deed, the new copy, stamped and recorded and as official as the territorial government could make it, and she held it for a moment and then set it on the washstand where she could see it. Her father's land. Her land. 412 acres of dark valley soil and old cottonwood trees and a creek running clear over pale stones. Hers. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror and she was smiling, and she let herself. The weeks that followed were the kind that build something, that have the texture of real life being assembled from its component parts. Anna took the morning work at the hotel, $4 a week, which was not a fortune but was consistent, and spent her afternoons in Walter's office or at the small desk she rented from Mrs. Cord, writing letters and doing arithmetic and building, on paper, the beginning of the farm she intended to have. Walter rode out to the Caro Creek bank with her in the third week and introduced her to Ellis, who was a compact, direct man in his 50s who looked at the deed and the land survey and Anna's written proposal and asked 14 practical questions, all of which she answered, and offered her a short-term loan at a rate that was fair by the standards of the territory and contingent on the first year's crop as partial security. She signed it. She walked out of the bank into the Caro Creek afternoon with a banker's draft in her hand, and her hands were steady. "How do you feel?" Walter asked. "Like someone who just bet everything on herself," she said. "Good odds," he said. She turned her head and looked at him as they walked, and something about the easy certainty of his statement, not reassurance, not flattery, just a practical assessment that he happened to mean, made her reach out and take his arm briefly, the way you'd take the arm of someone you trusted entirely, and he covered her hand with his for a moment before she took it back, and neither of them said anything about it, and both of them carried it. The months of that autumn became a rhythm. Anna went back and forth between Harrow Bend and the land in Caro County, beginning the first clearing, engaging a carpenter named Duff to begin the foundations of a small house on the creek-facing slope. Walter came with her most times, not every time, not intrusively, but often enough that it became natural, his presence on those rides out through the morning country, the conversations they had over packed lunches on the creek bank about the shape of the coming operation, about the territory's water politics, about books they had both read, about their respective histories and ideas, and the things they wanted their lives to mean. He told her about a woman he had briefly been close to in his deputy years, a schoolteacher named Mary who had gone back to her family in Ohio because the territory felt too far from everything she knew. He told it simply, without bitterness, as something that had been real and had ended clearly. She told him about a man in St. Louis, an attorney's clerk named Richard, who had been attentive and well-meaning, but had assumed that her intelligence was ornamental and had been visibly unsettled when it turned out to be structural, and whom she had parted from after 8 months with no particular grief on either side. These were the things you told someone when you were explaining who you were before they arrived, and they listened to each other's histories with the respect that comes from understanding that other lives had been lived, that the people in front of you were already fully themselves before you met them. In October, the house on the creek-facing slope had its walls and half its roof, and Anna stood inside the half-finished room and looked at the view out the open doorway toward the cottonwoods, and felt something she had not felt since childhood, the specific physical certainty of being in the right place. Walter stood in the doorway behind her. She didn't hear him come up, but she felt him, the particular quality of his presence, which she had come to recognize the way you recognized a voice you knew well. "It's going to be good," he said. "It's going to be good," she agreed. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, both of them looking out at the cottonwoods and the creek and the long slope of the valley in the October light, which was different from the summer light, cooler, more golden, with the particular tenderness that autumn had in that country. "Anna," he said. She waited. "I have something I want to say to you, and I want to say it plainly without any speeches around it." "Please," she said. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the second evening in Harrow Bend, when you told me that fixing things mattered even when they didn't stay fixed, and you said it like you had been living by it for years. I have said nothing because you had enough on your mind and because I didn't want you to feel that my help came with strings attached to it. It didn't. It came free. But I've been quiet for 3 months, and I am no longer willing to be quiet about it." She turned to look at him. His expression was entirely serious and entirely open, with the same unflinching directness he brought to everything he cared about. "I am not quiet about things," she said. "You know that about me." "I do," he said. "I have been in love with you since the creek, the first evening by the creek in Harrow Bend," she said. "When you described this land, when you described the cottonwoods and the morning light in the valley, you were describing something you had paid attention to, and the way you paid attention to things is the thing about you that I—" She stopped and started again. "I love the way you attend to things. I love that you are honest. I love that you help without diminishing. I love that you are exactly who you present yourself to be, which is rarer than it should be." She paused. "I love you, Walter." The space between them closed without either of them being entirely sure who moved first. His hands came to her face and hers went to the front of his jacket, and she stood on the unfinished floor of her half-built house on her father's land and kissed Walter Carver with everything she had, and he kissed her back with all the steadiness and thoroughness that characterized him. And the cottonwoods went on being old and enormous outside, and the creek went on talking, and the October light came through the open doorway and lay gold on the dusty floor around them. When they separated, she kept her hands on his jacket and he kept his hands framing her face, and they looked at each other from a very short distance. 3 months is too long to be quiet," she said. "It really was," he said. She laughed. He kissed her again, briefer and warmer, and she thought that the second kiss was somehow even better than the first because it was easier, because there was already history in it. Burl Hackett, it turned out, was not finished. In November, 6 weeks after the courthouse ruling, 2 weeks after the moment in the unfinished house, a notice arrived at the Cairo County Land Office on behalf of Hackett's lawyer, Hammond Cross, claiming new evidence of fraud in the original 1872 Ralston purchase and requesting a review of the deed's validity. It was, in Walter's professional judgment, a delay tactic, an attempt to tie up the land in procedural uncertainty long enough that Anna would give up and sell, or long enough that some other approach could be brought to bear. He brought her the notice at the hotel and watched her face while she read it. She read it carefully twice. She set it down. She looked at him. "What do they think they have?" she asked. "Nothing. There is nothing to find about the 1872 purchase because your father was an honest man who made an honest transaction. The only fraud was Dodd's, and Dodd's fraud was committed against your father and against Hackett equally. Hackett knows this. Cross knows this. This is paper warfare." "Then we fight paper warfare," Anna said. "What do we need?" letters from St. Louis confirming the original transaction. The notary, the record of registration, any correspondence your father kept. I have correspondence, Anna said. She went to her trunk and pulled out a small bundle tied with kitchen twine. Her father's letters about the land, which she had brought with her from St. Louis against exactly this kind of possibility, because her father had told her once that a man who keeps his letters has a record of himself that no one can take away. Walter took the bundle and went through it carefully, and by the end of the evening they had assembled everything needed to demonstrate the complete and unimpeachable legitimacy of the original purchase, and Walter had written a response to the notice that was, in Anna's assessment, about as close to devastating as formal legal language could get. It went back to Cross via the land office, and the matter was never raised again. Hackett moved his cattle off the Ralston land in December and did not return. He did, however, in January, appear at the hotel in Harrow Bend where Anna was at breakfast. He came in with his hat in his hand, which was a gesture that apparently cost him something, and he sat down at her table without being invited, which she permitted. He was a difficult man to read. The bluster was gone, in its place something more complicated. I was cheated too, he said after a moment. By Dodd, I paid good money for that land and thought it was clean. I know, Anna said. The judge made that clear. I don't ask you to feel sorry about it. Good, she said, because I don't have an obligation to feel sorry for a man who spent 2 years trying to take my legal property through procedural harassment. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'd like to propose a water-sharing arrangement, he said. My north range runs along your eastern fence. The creek is yours by deed, but there's a seasonal stream that crosses both properties. A formal agreement on water access would be to both our benefits. Anna looked at him. Write a proposal, she said. A fair one with equal obligations on both sides. I'll have Walter Carver look at it, and if it's fair, I'll agree to it. He nodded. He stood up. He looked at her with an expression that had lost the dismissiveness of the courtroom entirely, replaced by something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. You're going to make something of that land, he said. Yes, she said. I am. He left. She finished her breakfast. The water-sharing agreement, reviewed and revised by Walter and signed by both parties in February of 1879, was fair. Hackett remained a neighbor, which was not the same as being a friend, but was manageable, and the territorial West was large enough that people learned to be practical about the lives adjacent to their own. The house was finished in December, a week before Christmas. It was small, 4 rooms, a proper fireplace, a covered porch facing the cottonwoods, a good roof, but it was solid and well-placed and looked as though it had a future. Anna moved in on a Wednesday in the first week of December, with her trunk and her satchel and the framed photograph of her mother that she placed on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. She stood in the finished front room with the fire going in the new fireplace and looked at the photograph of her mother, and then out the window at the cottonwoods standing in the winter light, and she felt the completeness of the moment, her mother's face, her father's land, her own life taking shape around her. Walter knocked on the porch door and she called him in, and he came in with a bundle of sage tied with twine and handed it to her without explanation, and she understood it was a house gift, and it made her laugh with pleasure. He looked around the finished room with satisfaction. Well built, he said. Duff does good work, she said. He does, Walter agreed. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. He said nothing, but he crossed to it and looked at it for a moment with that attentive quality he gave to things, and she understood that he was paying her mother the courtesy of being properly seen. They ate supper together by the fire that first evening in the house. She had cooked on the new stove, a simple meal of beans and biscuits and coffee, and the warmth of the room and the light on the walls and the sound of the creek outside in the cold dark all combined into something that felt specifically like beginning. He stayed until the evening was late, and then he did not stay, which was correct, and when he stood to leave she walked him to the porch door, and they stood for a moment in the door with the cold air coming in, and he kissed her good night in the way that had become their particular greeting and farewell, sure and warm and sufficient. "I'll come Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. He rode back toward Harrow Bend in the dark, and she watched his lantern go down the valley road and disappear, and went inside to her house and her fire and her beginning. By spring Anna had 12 acres plowed on the south-facing valley floor, with wheat seed in the ground, bought with the bank loan and purchased from a seed merchant in Caro Creek who had tested the soil by her description and declared it suitable. She had also purchased 2 work horses, a milk cow, 6 laying hens, and a border collie puppy of uncertain temperament whom she named Judge, partly because he looked authoritative and partly because Walter had suggested it with such a perfect deadpan that she had laughed for a full minute. Walter had not moved to the land with her. They were, in the consideration of 1879 Caro County, doing things in the proper order, which meant he was still based in Harrow Bend, and came to the Ralston land on weekends, and on any other day when the distance between them became unworkable. He had told her in February, clearly and simply, that he intended to ask her to marry him, but that he wanted to ask when the timing was right for her and her life, not when it was merely what came next in the sequence, and that she should tell him when that was. She had told him in March, on a morning when the first wheat shoots were showing above the soil, and the cottonwoods were putting out their small yellow leaves, and the valley was full of the specific light that came with early spring in New Mexico, and the creek was running high from snowmelt, and the whole country seemed to be making a case for itself. She had been standing at the porch railing with her coffee, and he had ridden up the valley road with the morning behind him, and she had looked at him coming up the road on his horse in the spring morning and known, with the certainty that arrived like a physical fact, that there was no better moment than this one, and there never would be. He had gotten down from his horse and come up the porch steps, and she had taken his face in her hands and looked at him and said, "Now is when, Walter. Ask me now." He had smiled, that full, unguarded smile, and he had asked her properly with her face in his hands, and the spring light all around them, and judged the border collie sitting between their feet with his tongue out, and she had said yes with her whole heart and no qualification. They were married in May of 1879, in Harrow Bend, in the small church on the corner of the main street, in a ceremony attended by Mrs. Cord and her husband, the land office clerk who had sent Anna to Walter in the first place, the carpenter Duff and his wife, 3 neighboring ranchers, the Caro Creek Bank manager Ellis, and Walter's old friend from his surveying days, a quiet man named Brooke who had come up from Las Cruces for the occasion, and shook Anna's hand after the ceremony with both of his and said, "I've known Walter for 8 years, and I have never seen him as settled as he is standing beside you right now." And she had believed him completely. She wore the dark blue traveling suit because it was the best thing she owned, and because there was a rightness in it. She had worn it to the courthouse, which had been the beginning of everything, and wearing it on this day completed something. Walter wore a clean white shirt and his good coat, and looked at her in the church with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe in the reality of his own good fortune, which she found touching and entirely mutual. They spoke their vows to each other in the plain language of the Protestant ceremony, and when the minister said the final words and Walter kissed her, the small congregation in the small church in the small town in the vast territory made the warm human sounds of people who were pleased for something good happening to someone who deserved it. They went back to the Ralston land, the Carver Ralston land as they called it, because her name and her history were in the deed and were not being edited out, and Walter moved in properly, bringing his books and his surveying equipment and his single set of good dishes and his long legs and his steadiness and his considerable intelligence and his habit of paying full attention to the things that mattered. He kept his consulting work, riding out to surveys and property questions across the county, coming home in the evenings to the house on the creek-facing slope, where she was doing the arithmetic of a real farm operation. They ate supper together every night and argued pleasantly about the right way to do things and agreed on most of what mattered and disagreed productively on some of the rest. The wheat that first summer of their marriage came in well, not spectacularly, but solidly, better than cautious projections, well enough to make the first year's loan payment with something left over. Anna stood in her field on the harvest morning and ran her hand through the standing grain, and the satisfaction of it was physical and real. Walter came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood in the grain field in the early morning with the mountains blue in the distance and the creek talking at the edge of the land, and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. In November of 1879, Anna told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening by the fire, while he was reading and she had been sitting across from him with her own book and not reading it for half an hour, composing and discarding various approaches, and then simply putting her book down and saying, "Walter, I'm going to have a baby in the spring." He put his book down and looked at her with an expression that went through several things very quickly: surprise, recognition, joy so immediate it didn't wait for its cue, and he came across the room and sat beside her and took her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been for 2 months. I simply wanted to be sure before I said anything." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through everything, the gladness and the weight of it, the future assembling itself differently. And then he said, "Anna," and gathered her to him, and she held on and let herself feel the fullness of it, the life they had built and this new life beginning. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was cold but not brutal. Anna worked carefully, managing the farm through the quieter months, corresponding with the seed merchant about the next year's planting, maintaining the water-sharing arrangement with Hackett, who had turned out to be a bearable neighbor if not a warm one. Walter took on a significant surveying contract in the North County that kept him busy through January and February, but always brought him home by nightfall and sometimes earlier. They read to each other in the evenings. This had become their habit. He would read from whatever he was currently working through, or she from hers, and the other would listen or follow along. And the evenings had the warmth of people who were genuinely interested in each other's minds, not just their company. She had written to the Territorial Women's Land Rights Organization in Santa Fe, a small but determined group that worked to ensure women's legal ownership of property was protected under territorial law, and become a correspondent member, contributing notes from her own experience of the courthouse proceedings that they used as part of their advocacy materials. She did this with Walter's complete support and some of his editorial assistance, and the letters they wrote together on that subject were, she privately thought, among the best work either of them had produced. The boy arrived in April of 1880 in the house on the creek-facing slope, delivered by the doctor from Harrow Bend, who arrived with 2 hours to spare and was thoroughly competent. He was a solid, determined baby with dark hair, and as Anna remarked in the first exhausted hour, his father's particular expression of calm assessment. "He's examining things," Walter said, watching his son with an expression of undisguised wonder. "He is your child," Anna said. They named him Thomas, for her father, with James as a middle name for Walter's grandfather. Thomas James Carver was placed in his mother's arms in the house his grandfather's land had built, and squinted at the late April light coming through the window with an expression that suggested he was forming opinions about it. Walter sat on the edge of the bed beside Anna and looked at his son and his wife with the expression of a man who has found the full size of his own happiness and been somewhat surprised by it. "Thomas Ralston would have been glad of this," he said. "He would have," she said. "He would have liked you enormously. He would have asked you 17 questions about land law and then dragged you out to look at that elm tree." "I would have liked him too," Walter said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her carefully, and they sat together with their son in the house they had built on the land her father left her. And the creek ran outside, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the second wheat was 3 weeks from planting, and life had the particular solidity of things that have been truly made rather than simply happened upon. The territorial land rights work bore real results by 1881. The organization in Santa Fe, using among other documentation Anna's case summary of the Ralston deed dispute, successfully argued before the territorial legislature for a clarification of the adverse possession statute that required any such claim to establish good faith origin, exactly the principle that Judge Tate had applied in Anna's case, now codified. It was a small change in the language of one statute, but statutes shape lives, and Anna understood this with the clarity of someone whose life had been shaped by them. She wrote an account of it for a women's publication in Santa Fe with a readership across the territory, and the account was direct and specific and included both the legal argument and the personal history, and Walter read it before it went out and said, "Your father would have printed this himself." She sent it. The farm grew through 1881 and 1882, more acreage, a second workhorse, a neighbor girl hired 2 days a week while Thomas was small. The wheat operation expanding into a modest fruit orchard on the north slope, planted with apple trees sourced from a grower in the northern part of the territory who assured her they were suited to the altitude and soil. The house gained a back room and a proper root cellar, and a small covered barn built by Duff's son, who had learned his father's trade with the same solid competence. Walter's surveying practice grew as the territory developed, and he took on a junior assistant, a young man named Sam Farrell, fresh from an engineering program back east, 23 years old and enthusiastic, whom they had at the house for supper most Sunday evenings, until he began walking out with the doctor's daughter from Harrow Bend, whereupon his Sunday evenings became somewhat less available. Thomas grew at the speed children did, which was to say appallingly fast. He was a serious, curious boy who had both his mother's directness and his father's habit of thorough observation, and this combination meant that by the time he was 2, he could identify the hawk species over the valley and had strong opinions about which of the horses was better. He was also, Anna noted, absolutely fearless around water, which meant the creek bank required supervision that she and Walter traded off with the efficiency of 2 people who had organized their life around equal partnership and had not found it as difficult as some people seemed to expect. In the spring of 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter, delivered with rather more speed than the doctor would have preferred, with Walter serving as primary assistant, competent under circumstances as always. They named her Clara Me. She arrived with her eyes open and an expression of inquiry that made both her parents laugh in the first startled moment, and Judge the border collie, who was now an elderly and distinguished animal, came in and smelled her and approved. Clara Me was from the beginning her brother's opposite in temperament, quick where he was deliberate, loud where he was quiet, inclined to dramatic declarations rather than careful assessment. Thomas adored her with the resigned affection of an older sibling who recognizes a force of nature and decides to be allied with it. Anna and Walter watched their children grow with the same complete, sustaining attention they gave to each other and the land. The dinners around the kitchen table became elaborate discussions in which Thomas asked careful questions and Clara Me made sweeping pronouncements, and Walter explained things with patience and Anna challenged assumptions with the precision she had always brought to everything, and the house was full of the noise of minds engaging with the world. By 1884, the Carver-Ralston land was a genuinely functioning farm. The wheat was reliable, and the orchard was beginning its first real production, the apple trees having taken well to the valley soil. They had hired 2 permanent hands, Jose, a steady man from the southern part of the territory, whose family had farmed that country for generations and who knew the soil and water in his bones, and a young woman named Emma who was Jose's cousin and who had come asking for work on a Tuesday morning and departed the same day as the farm's bookkeeper and supply manager. having demonstrated in the course of an hour's conversation that she was considerably more organized than either Anna or Walter about the ledger side of things. The territory was changing. The railroad had come to New Mexico, and the changes it brought were complicated opportunity and disruption, development and displacement, money moving at speeds the land couldn't always absorb. Anna watched it and wrote about it in her correspondence and in occasional pieces for the Santa Fe publication. Walter surveyed its edges and talked to the families whose land was in its path, and sometimes helped them understand what they owned and what that ownership was worth, legally and practically. There were places where the territory's older injustices were being made worse by the new development Apache families dispossessed again. The same story Walter had described from his deputy years, playing out in new forms with new money and new legal vehicles. Anna and Walter both gave what they could: time, legal knowledge, documentation, the particular usefulness of two people who understood property law and were willing to use it on behalf of others. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was something, and they had both decided long ago to keep doing something. On an evening in the autumn of 1884, 6 years after Anna Ralston had arrived on the wrong stagecoach in Harrow Bend with a land deed, and a determination that the territory had not known what to do with, she and Walter sat on the porch of the house on the creek-facing slope after the children were in bed, and the work of the day was done, with coffee and the cooling air and the stars coming out over the valley. The cottonwoods at the creek were turning gold in the October dark, their leaves catching whatever light came from the slice of moon. The creek sound was low and steady, the sound that the land made to itself in the dark. The horses were quiet in the barn. The orchard was a dim pattern of shapes on the north slope. The wheat field was bare now after harvest, dark and resting. "Do you know what I thought," Anna said, "that first day on the porch of the Harrow Bend Hotel, when I was sitting there with my cold coffee after you went home?" "Tell me," he said. He had his arm along the back of her chair and she was leaning into it, which was their habitual evening configuration. "I thought that is a man who sees things as they are, who doesn't neaten them up for his own comfort or for anyone else's. And I thought that was the rarest thing I had encountered in a very long time, and I was sitting on a hotel porch in a town I had arrived in by mistake, and I thought, well, whatever happens next, tonight was worth the wrong stagecoach." He was quiet for a moment. "The wrong stagecoach," he said. "The wrong stagecoach," she said, "which gave me the right everything else." He turned and kissed her temple, and she tilted her head against his. "I thought you were the most capable person I had seen walk through that door," he said. "And I thought this is not going to be simple. This is a complicated situation with a woman who is going to be absolutely unmovable about the correct answer. And I thought that was the most appealing thing I had encountered in a very long time." She laughed. "Unmovable," she said. "Completely," he said. "About things that matter, and entirely reasonable about things that don't, which is exactly right." They sat in the evening and the stars came all the way out. The territory spread itself around them, enormous and indifferent and full of its own ancient life. And they sat within it the way people do when they have made something real in a place that was not designed to make things easy, with the particular satisfaction of having done the difficult work, and having done it together, and having found in the doing that the partnership was itself the best of what they had built. Thomas appeared at the door in his night-clothes, serious-faced in the way he always was when he had a question that had kept him awake. "Pa," he said, "what happens to the wheat roots in winter? Do they die or do they sleep?" Walter looked at Anna. She looked at him. The moon was up now. "Come sit with us for a minute," Walter said, "and I'll tell you." Thomas came out and settled between them on the porch bench, with the weight of a 7-year-old making itself comfortable, and Walter explained what roots did in winter. How the cold was not an ending but a preparation, how the earth held what was planted there, how the sleep of winter was the groundwork for what came up in spring, and Anna listened to him explain it and watched her son's serious face following every word, and the creek went on talking below the cottonwoods. and the stars went all the way to the horizon, and everything that needed to be said was said, and everything that needed to be built was built, and the territory that had once looked at Anna Ralston arriving on the wrong stagecoach with a land deed and a temper that wouldn't quit had found itself, in time, the better for all of it. Thomas fell asleep against his father's arm before the explanation was finished. Walter picked him up without breaking stride and carried him inside, and Anna held the door, and the house took them in, warm and lamplit and full of the particular goodness of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. She stood for one more moment on the porch before following, looking out at the cottonwoods and the creek and the orchard and the dark valley floor where the wheat would come up again in spring, all 412 acres of it, hers and theirs and the children's after them, and thought of her father standing by his elm tree in the evening light incent. Louis with nothing but hope and a letter from a man he should not have trusted, and she thought that hope was a strange and persistent thing, that it traveled across distances and years, and found its way into the hands of the people who would know what to do with it, and she was glad, profoundly and completely, that the wrong stagecoach had brought her to the right place and the right life and the right man, and that she had been unmovable about what mattered. She went inside. She closed the door behind her. The valley settled into its deep October dark, the creek speaking quietly to itself, the cottonwoods standing old and enormous under the stars, and the lamp in the window of the house on the slope burned steady and warm against the night.